Okay, thank you, Neil. Um, so, as Neil mentioned in the introduction, I'm both a student and an educator. So I find myself in a sort of interesting liminal space, which affords me a sort of different perspective when I'm thinking about what are students and educators alike feeling when approaching AI tools like ChatGPT. I can sort of access both elements. Um, so I'd like to just preface this presentation by saying that I'm only at the beginning of my PhD research. So this presentation forms part of my PhD research in English literature into reading for feeling. So this just represents the start. And also, I'm not purporting to be an expert on AI or affect theory. I'll bring in affect theory a little bit later, but it's basically sort of the theory of emotional states. But I merely have thoughts and feelings that I want to probe further. So I hope that this presentation yields a lot of fascinating discussions and debate, and I hope that I hope that it raises some fascinating questions for you. Okay. Is it right? Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so I'm going to start with something a bit unusual, but basically a reading memory. So I want you to think back to a reading memory, a vivid memory of reading. Where were you? What were you reading? And what were you feeling? So the reason why I have this picture of a tower is because I have this vivid memory of when I was a child sitting on top of this assembled tower. So I had like a plastic kiddies table, and then I had a dining room chair on top of that, and then I had like another plastic kiddies chair on top of that, and then I sat atop of that, and I was reading Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. And I raise this memory because the place, the situation, the site of reading was as important as what I was reading. So think, for example, about reading on the beach, how the sights and smells intermingle with what you're reading and what you're imagining. So I have another quite vivid memory of later on when I was in high school, when I was reading The Plague by Albert Camus, and there was this awful tortured scream coming from this young boy who had been infected with the plague, with the virus. And I was sitting on the beach and enjoying the smells and the ocean air. And all throughout this, I'm reading about this awful set of events. And so there was this interesting interplay between the site in which I was reading and what I was reading. So I want to come to one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite pieces of academic literature, which is The Pleasure of the Text by Roland Barthes. So I'm going to read through this quickly, and I want you to think about whether you identify with any of this. So, text of pleasure, the text that contents, fills, grants euphoria, the text that comes from culture and does not break with it, is linked to a comfortable practice of reading. Text of bliss, the text that imposes a state of loss, the text that discomforts, perhaps to the point of a certain boredom, unsettles the reader's historical, cultural, psychological assumptions, the consistency of his tastes, values, memories, brings to a crisis his relation with language. So I'm going to go to a small little reflection in a moment about where I'd like you to put in the chat what you experience more of, but I also want you to think about how often are students actually experiencing pleasure or bliss when they're reading, if they're reading, especially if they're going to chatbots like ChatGPT and they're getting a whole bunch of analytical material from it. Are they really reading for meaning? And as I'll come to later, are they reading for feeling? Are they experiencing any of these affective responses, such as pleasure and bliss? So I'd love to actually see some of what you have written here. I'll see if I can somehow access the chat. My two screens are doing strange things, but even if I can just read afterwards, I'd love to see when you read, which sensation do you experience the most often? So would it be pleasure or bliss, or both? Although I do want to say that going back to Barthes, he does make this very clear distinction that pleasure is about comfortable reading and bliss is about uncomfortable, unsettling reading that really disrupts something inside of you. So then, why do you think this is the case if you experience pleasure or bliss more often? Then, Which sensation brings about the most memorable reading experience? Would that be pleasure or bliss? Why do you think so? So you can approach any one of these questions if you want to think about it yourself, or if you want to put it in the chat. I'd be very interested to hear what you have to say. Okay, so let's move on to the context of why I'm talking about this and what I'm talking about. So many of us who have educational experience where texts are involved, this involves active reading and critical engagement, know that some students struggle with accessing higher order meanings. So where do we see this? We see it in assessments, in their output, in their writing. And as has been discussed in the conference over and over, is that the problem with written assessments is that it is a space for plagiarism, and now for ChatGPT to enter into the fray. I also want to point to the fact that if we ask an analytical question expecting an analytical response, and students are resorting to ChatGPT, what does that tell us about our assessments? And more importantly, students' reading for meaning competencies. So I'd also like to point to the fact that I think we are beyond the point of being punitive. I think this has also come up time and again during this conference, that we need to think carefully about integration. What about the reading process? Where are students at when they encounter a text? So this is the projected findings of my study. I think that we need to intervene at the processual level, at the level of reading for meaning itself. We need to develop reading pedagogies that not only encourage more active and engaged reading, but also promote greater understanding. How do we do that? Well, I propose reading for feeling. So developing and expanding upon reading for feeling pedagogies will potentially intervene where AI cannot at the reading for meaning level, and we must intervene at the human level. So I've put an image here of the couch. For those who are familiar with psychoanalysis or even with popular culture surrounding psychoanalysis, you'll have heard of the phrase, "How does that make you feel?" which is supposedly what every therapist will ask you. And this is Freud's couch that changed everything. And yes, there was an actual couch. So if I think back to my own therapeutic experience when I was receiving psychoanalytic psychotherapy, there was an actual couch. And I remember asking my therapist, can I use the couch? Like, can we explore this? And they said to me, no, we're not ready for that quite yet. You know, we need more sessions for that. It needs to be more times during the week. But so what I'm trying to say is that it was screened off. That not only was the couch the site of feeling that was sort of limited, that I had limited access to, but it was also located entirely within the therapy room. So I wanted to bring in my own experience about that, because I think many of us, when we think about feeling, we think about things like therapy. We think about that perennial question, how does that make you feel? And what I want to ask is there space for feeling in the classroom? So what is reading for feeling? And keep on thinking about, is there space for feeling in the classroom as I go throughout? So reading for feeling is an umbrella term to describe an experience of reading in which our emotional states, which is our affect, that arise while we are reading a text are felt, described, and reflected upon. So what about feeling? Why is feeling important? So I've noticed in my teaching, I've noticed when I've talked to other academics, that feeling is either pushed aside in the classroom or marshaled during debate. So we usually tell students not to argue from emotion, that such a practice is a logical fallacy. And I've seen this all the time. And students are often surprised when I say to them, no, you can, this is in English literature, obviously, but no, you can write in the first person. You can tell me what you're feeling when you read this text. It's not something that they're used to. Coming out of high school into university, they're told not to argue from emotion, that they're making critical analyses, and that there's no room for feeling in that. So that point about the logical fallacy, that such a practice of arguing from emotion is a logical fallacy, I want to say that that's not the point. If all we cared about was assessing critical thinking and assessed output, then yes, there is no place for arguing from emotion. If, however, we are concerned with the general experience of learning, and the pedagogy that underpins that experience, then we need to look at affect. So the processual aspect of learning is coming up here, which has come up throughout the conference, the process of learning. And that is where I think we need to be focusing on affect. And I think affect has been sitting just off center throughout this conference from the talks that I've seen, that affect has been there, that it's been addressed, but I want to talk about it with more presence, and I want to bring it into the conversation, that we need to look at affect. So what is affect anyway? So affect is both a noun and a verb. As a noun, it is an emotional state, and as a verb, it is to have an impact on. Together, and this is a quote from a reading by Stephen Ahern from 2017, but the actual quote is from Eric Schaus. So together, the noun and the verb aspect of affect, at any moment, hundreds, perhaps thousands of stimuli impinge upon the human body, and the body responds by infolding them all at once and registering them as an intensity. Affect is this intensity. So what about languaging affect? And I'll come back to the point about intensity in a moment. We often have trouble putting language to our emotions. I'm sure that we can all identify with this. We often register the emotion as an intensity, which is sometimes just overwhelming. So certainly from my experience, sometimes when I'm feeling a lot of strong emotions and I think, and when I'm asked how am I feeling, I'll just say, I'm feeling overwhelmed. I don't know what I'm feeling. But what we don't always realize is that there are multiple layers to languaging emotion. Beneath your anger, which is easier to feel, you can be experiencing a deep sadness, which is more difficult to sit with, at least from my perspective. You can also be surprised at your anger or your sadness or both. So when it comes to languaging emotion, languaging affect, there have been many approaches to this. One of them is to try and apprehend it linguistically using something like the wheel of emotions. So I really love this wheel of emotions. I've seen it used in the therapeutic space, but I don't know if it's really entered the educational field, the field of tertiary education. And I'd love to see it actually be used in terms of what I'm talking about. So what this wheel of emotions does is you can access the primary emotions, which are easy to identify, sort of. So let's just say I'm feeling happy. So what kind of happy am I feeling? Oh, I'm feeling proud, or I'm feeling optimistic. And then you move on from that. I'm feeling creative. I'm feeling confident. You know, these are the very positive emotions, but let's just say you're just feeling angry. So what kind of angry are you feeling? And is there perhaps an interpolation between the anger that you're feeling and perhaps some sadness? So there's so many words that we can use to describe feeling that we don't always access in the moment, which we can't always access in the moment because we don't necessarily have that emotional literacy. So here we get to emotional literacy. So many of us struggle to access emotion as it is. But why is it important for students? Why is this important for students who engage with any kind of text? Is accessing emotion always productive? And what disciplines can such a literacy be useful in? So I'm coming from an English literature perspective, and I think absolutely in English literature, emotional literacy is very important. Philosophy, I'd love to hear from the philosophers if there are any here, if there is room for accessing affect in that particular space. Politics, I'm not a politics student, but I know that a lot of emotive language is used and studied and analyzed, and even law, it also uses emotive language. But does this only reside in the humanities, or can this permeate the sciences as well, for example? I'm not sure, but I'm posing that question. So I want to speak about putting the human back into the humanities, which I know sounds a little bit twee, but I think so often with the humanities, we're focused on analysis and critical thinking, and ChatGPT can come in and do that quite well. What ChatGPT can't do is feel, and what makes us most human is that we feel. So affect is what makes us human. Students who are using ChatGPT to write essays are likely engaging with texts that evoke some kind of response, and these responses are inevitable. So instead of ignoring these responses, why don't we bring them into the learning environment? And I want to alight on something very important here, and this will be raised as a concern later as well, but of safe spaces. Is the classroom really a safe space to open up these dimensions? Is this why we've avoided it in the past? Is this why we haven't seen effective response being brought into the literary classroom, for example, because the classroom can be such a contentious space to raise these issues? Also, how can we adequately equip educators to handle trauma or other intense emotional responses when they arise in an appropriate manner? And also, quite importantly, what kind of new responsibilities is this putting on already strained educators? So is this, for example, putting the hat of the counselor on the therapist? And I'll be getting to that a bit later. So I want to address the ChatGPT in the room. So there's the scramble to compensate, to adapt, to change. And we've seen this throughout the conference. We are very much at the beginning stages of our collective encounter with AI. And I think we all know a certain amount, but we are learning. We are all in the process of learning. And speaking of learning, much of the impact on learning itself is being felt short term. And I want to ask, what will the long-term impact be, not just on graduate readiness, but on learning competencies in general? And then with regards to reading for meaning, surely this is threatened when a chatbot can automatically produce textual analysis. So we've been talking a lot about looking back, and I really do agree with that. But I also want to talk about looking inside and beside. So the experience of reading while being potentially undermined by AI chatbots will always have the dimensions of emotion and what we imagine when we read. It's fantasy. These are personal, subjective, fluid experiences. They do not necessarily translate easily into the realm of assessment. So that's going to be one of the questions that I think will be raised a lot today, perhaps at the end of my talk, is how do we bring emotions into the realm of assessment, and should we? And I think that's a very important question. But besides being an inside experience, the experience of reading is also a B-side experience. So while usually private, it can also be versus reading aloud to others, discussing text with peers. So what is fantasy? So I'm not going to go through this entire quote, but I'll just alight on some important things. This is from Edmund, who was one of the originators, or he talked about fantasy in the phenomenological sense, and phenomenology is the study of consciousness as it relates to lived experience. So fantasy is this mental disposition. It's an ability. So we can view it as a psychic experience that that a person produces in themselves. So this is in terms of the artist, or that they awaken in us by means of their work. So I'd like to just pause on that for a moment, that fantasy is a mental activity. It's cognitive. So that's what I want to be taken from that particular slide. And then we have fantasy or fantasy. So this is when I tend to pronounce fantasy as fantasy, just to differentiate the two. So fantasy is mental images we conjure up in our minds. It's a mental disposition. And fantasy is fantasy with a story. So there we think of fantasy normally as a genre, or to fantasize is to conjure up a story that can be fanciful, but is always underpinned by mental imagery, which is fantasy. And then fantasy and emotion or affect are intertwined. Again, I don't think I have time to go through this entire slide, but basically what Breyer et al. Are saying here in their Phenomenology of Fantasy and Emotion, which was a book published in 2022, is that fantasies cannot be analyzed in isolation from affect, and affect cannot be analyzed in isolation from fantasy. I also think that fantasy can be used as a tool to access emotion. So affect is precognitive. It's a quality of experience that is intense, yet registers below the threshold of cognition. fantasy is a cognitive activity. So perhaps accessing fantasy, what we see, first, we may then be able to access deeper folds of affect, what we feel, which underlie that initial fantasy. So fantasy is a gateway to affect. Okay, and I think I'll skip over that. I was going to talk about my experience of teaching Purple Hibiscus, because this is a very difficult text to teach. You encounter a lot of difficult knowledge in that there's a lot of triggering material in the text. There's a lot of scenes of abuse, and I struggle to read this text, and I struggle to teach this text. So keep in mind that idea of difficult knowledge. Okay, so I'm gonna skip over that too. I want to get to like my main point because I really do want to have a discussion about this. That's really what I want to bring here. So this is an encounter that I had with ChatGPT, which I spoke about in my abstract. I'm not really going to go through it again, but basically what ChatGPT did was it hallucinated. It provided the wrong passage. And I said that wasn't the last passage of the road. And it said, apologies for the confusion. You are correct. So we've been talking about this a lot, that ChatGPT hallucinates. But then I tried to access a feeling aspect, an affective aspect of ChatGPT. So I asked it to integrate this quote from Lovecraft. And sorry that you couldn't read that slide, but it's basically just a quote from Lovecraft from The Call of Cthulhu. But I asked it to integrate this quote into an argument about how AI chatbots may allow for the piecing together of dissociated knowledge in such a way that humans are spared from madness. And that relates to the Lovecraft quote. And ChatGPT responded really well. And it provided some very interesting points about how we can offload the burden of piecing together complex and potentially disturbing information. That we have certain cognitive limitations as humans that AI can actually synthesize. But then I asked it to access feeling, and I said, your answer made me feel very uneasy. And its responses were very strange, and it had this sort of projected subjectivity to it. It said things like, if you're comfortable, and you could share specific aspects that triggered your discomfort. And so the more I probed ChatGPT, the less I got access to that realm of feeling, because obviously, this is what ChatGPT said, it lacks genuine consciousness, emotions, and intentions, which we already know. So this is really one of my final slides. What can we do? What do we do with all of this information? So my PhD research will look into developing and expanding upon teaching methodologies that encourage students to reflect on their own emotional responses to the text, in addition to deploying critical thinking skills and close textual analysis. So one idea I had was a sort of unassessed reading diary. And this would work really well for literary studies, I think, where students can read an extract and report on their affective responses, their fantasies and sensations. They can compare notes in pairs and report back in class. And then optionally, they can also compare how their affective responses play into their analyses of the text. And then some concerns after opening a can of worms, which I predict I have. How do we mediate the intensity of responses from a diversity of students? And what about triggering texts that elicit a trauma response? So students are going to be triggered. This is inevitable. Do we obfuscate that response, or do we help the students feel seen and supported? And then where does the responsibility of the educator in this regard end and the counselor begin? So that's also a very important, very large question that I don't know how to answer, but it certainly comes up in these discussions. How do we apply these conjectures in practice? And then finally, how do we encourage and revitalize a love of reading and learning by accessing, not recessing, affect in the age of AI? But thank you very much. I'd love to have some discussions and see what people think about what I've said. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Simon. Do we have any comments for Simon? For your first question that you posed, there are comments or responses on the chat. I don't know if you're able to see that.
Yes, no, I can see it now. Because I've clicked off my presentation, I can finally see what people have said.
Okay.
I can probably get to some of these points and respond to them afterwards, but if anybody has any questions for me to raise verbally, I'd also be happy to engage with that in mind as well. Yes, I see a question from Colette.
Hi, Simon. I enjoyed that so much. Thank you. This might be a bit niche, but this is something that I've come up against in my own reading around these things and also in teaching. There's a perception that reading increases empathy, which might be due in part to a failure to understand that people with more empathy tend to read more fiction. It might be the other way around. But there's a conflation between theory of mind, the ability to understand, to put oneself in the position of another and understand why they might take certain actions, and a kind of a sentimental empathy where you focus on feeling. And some of the more interesting research suggests that, in fact, high affect may not promote empathy, because it sort of just allows people to feel drunk on their own emotion and actually makes them blind to others and indeed blind to the meaning of a text. Because it's simply, someone picks up on a word, a feeling, and wants to feel something and then indulges that. I'm not sure if that makes sense. But I just wondered if you had anything to say about empathy.
Such an interesting question. And I really love the way that you talked about the centripetal, so the inward-looking aspect of emotion.
Yeah.
That we're very much, that we can get drunk on emotion, as you said. And that is something that I'm worried about, that if I or another educator were to bring affect into the classroom, that emotion would supersede empathy, that there would be such an outpouring of emotion and it would be so subjective and self-centered that there wouldn't be space for empathic interactions between other students.
Yeah.
And I don't really know where the line lies. I sort of hope that students can, with their own discretion, take a step back and say, okay, I'm feeling this very strongly, but other people are also feeling very strongly. And I think that in having those encounters and those interactions, which are very difficult, maybe their emotional literacy and our emotional literacy as educators can be ameliorated or improved in some way. I don't know if that makes sense, but maybe in those difficult encounters where students are coming up against very strong emotions, that empathy can kind of come through as a sort of mediating aspect.
Yeah, that entirely makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks. There's another hand. I want to see who it is.
I think it's mine.
Diane. Hi.
Yeah. So that was fascinating, and it makes me think of Howard Gardner's work from several years, about 30 years ago, on different intelligences, multiple intelligences. So his most famous book on that was Frames of Mind, and he talks about interpersonal, I think 7, and then later he added an 8th intelligence. And so the logical deductive is only 1. Interpersonal is another, intrapersonal is another, which relates to being able to identify how you are feeling. And it seems to me that one of the interesting applications possibly of what you're discussing is to then, as lecturers, encourage development of a range of different intelligences rather than this obsessive focus on the logical deductive kinds of intelligence. Thanks.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful comment about the many layers and dimensions to intelligence. You get emotional intelligence as one of them. I think I'm sort of familiar with the ideas that you were raising. But yes, absolutely, there is this kind of obsessive focus on analysis and on cognitive thinking and cognition, but not enough focus on affect and on emotional intelligence and accessing and reconciling what you're feeling. So yeah, I really appreciate that point. Thank you. I see a hand from Sophia.
Hi, Simon. Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering if you might just comment briefly, and I suppose you could probably give a talk on this topic alone, but you mentioned that the difficulty of teaching purple hibiscus and that question of triggering. And I was wondering if you, in teaching that text, if you were able to find any strategies to deal with that difficulty of triggering, and how do you acknowledge that and still rein in the discussion, into the analytical and the academic sphere? I think it's really an important question, because it's also concerns the question of curriculum, and this is coming up a lot around the question of which text can, so-called, and cannot be taught.
I think what I experienced when I was teaching purple hibiscus was that very lack that I don't think I could contain those aspects of students being triggered. I very much came up against my own barriers, and that's, I think, what sort of inspired me to start looking into this in the first place. So we were having a discussion as a community of interpretive community with the class, and we were talking about the scenes of abuse in the novel, and some students were speculating that perhaps some readers may not interpret the abuse as abuse, but rather as some sort of discipline, and that there are so many different dimensions of understanding, and it all depends on how you've been raised and where you come from and what your particular dispositions are. And I think that comes back to empathy again as well. And I was very troubled by that not everyone is going to have the same response, that some people are going to say, this is discipline, others are going to say, I'm triggered, this is abuse. And how do you reconcile those two things? The multitude of effective responses. And I don't think I have an answer to that. So I'm hoping to address that in my PhD. It's a huge area, but very important. And I think the diversity of responses means that some students who get triggered will be coming up against other students who don't see that, who don't have that access.
Thank you. Thanks, Simon.
I see another hand. I'm not sure who it's from, though. I can't.
Hello,
Megan.
it's Megan. Can you hear me?
Megan?
Yes. Hi, Megan.
Hi. I'm at the moment, one of the things I'm thinking about in my own life is pedagogy and my approach to teaching and how to be a better teacher. And I think a question that I have, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, one of my instinctive affective responses to this is, but if I bring my emotions into my teaching, how am I controlling that? And obviously, like, that's a lot to do with me and my brain, but I think I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts about how you navigate bringing more affect into the classroom while still maintaining not authority, but a sense of the students not being alone in an emotional wasteland, if that makes any sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That's such a good question. And it's something that I've been thinking about as well. I've experienced this on a more micro level. I hosted a creative writing workshop with a few students last week, I think. And I had the opportunity to really open up about my own emotional struggles and my own insecurities. And that opened up the most incredible platform for discussion. And everyone was respectful of each other. Everybody shared. It was incredible. But it was a small group of people. There were about 6 participants, I think including myself, in a big classroom environment. The dynamics become so much more contested and difficult. And I guess I've always felt that it's weird to come into it as an educator as a completely blank slate, or as somebody completely screened off. I want to come through as somebody who also has feelings when encountering these texts, and I try to share as much as I can and sort of, I guess, bring myself into it so that I can ensure that students feel comfortable to share as well. But I'm also aware of the authority aspect that you're talking about, that I do maintain a certain authority, and that when I'm talking about my own effective responses and my own feelings, they may be seen as, you know, like the primary way of viewing things, or they may be seen as the facilitatory emotion. So again, I don't quite know. Yeah, it stumped me a bit. I think we've got to allow for the dynamics to emerge naturally, and I think the goal of the educator is to guide those dynamics in a way that doesn't impinge upon students' effective responses, but also maintains a level of decorum and respect and empathy. So perhaps that's where it comes in. So there has to be a level of control and mediation. But again, I'm not sure where the line is.
Thank you so much. That was such an interesting response.